Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here today. I hope you and your families are staying safe and healthy. On behalf of my colleagues at the Jewish Community Foundation of Los Angeles, including our President and CEO, Marvin Schottland, our Executive Vice President, Dan Rothblatt, and our Board of Trustees, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for the last webinar of the year, Financial Fluency in Families in the Context of Pandemics, Social Justice, and Change, with Joline Godfrey, an accomplished author, innovator in the field of financial education for families, and dear friend of the Foundation. I'm Naomi Strongen, Associate Director at the Foundation Center for Design Philanthropy. Before we get started, I want to remind you that we are recording this session, although the participants will remain anonymous. If you would like closed captioning, please press the button that says CC at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. I will be in conversation with Joline throughout. We would also love to hear from all of you. You are welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation by pressing the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and typing your question in the box. We will also leave time for audience Q&A at the end of the hour. The events we've experienced in the last few months, whether it is fighting COVID or rooting out racism and injustice, have made the Foundation and our donors' commitment to Tikkun Olam even more critical. To date, our generous family of donors has responded to emergency needs related to COVID with $5.4 million in grants locally and in Israel, and this number only continues to grow. In addition, I am proud to share that last month, the Foundation announced $325,000 in racial equity grants as a response to the social unrest we have been experiencing. And as many of you know, we redirected all of our institutional grants this year, totaling $8.5 million to respond to the immediate and long-term impacts of COVID locally and in Israel. Our work to address community needs does not end here. As most of you know, in addition to our institutional grant making and offering individuals and families different kinds of charitable accounts that make giving simpler and more tax effective, we work with donors to enhance charitable giving. We share our expertise and provide guidance through conversations about which type of assets might be best to give, which kind of charitable accounts to use, the best time for giving, and where the greatest needs are within our community. In addition, and most relevant to today's talk, the Foundation's Center for Design Philanthropy has on staff certified advisors who are trained to work with multi-generational families on exploring shared values, determining giving priorities, structuring your family's grant making, honoring legacy, and ultimately engaging in meaningful philanthropy together. We are here to assist you with finding ways to help our community in a way that feels meaningful to you and your family. And there is no better time than the present to do that. I encourage you to submit your grant request now and not wait until the end of the year. During these challenging times, the organizations could use the funds now, and it will also help with preventing a backlog at the end of the year. So a couple of weeks back, I received a call from a donor, a gentleman in his late 50s who has 3 daughters, one in high school, one in college, who since the pandemic is living at home, and the oldest, who recently graduated from college and is also now living at home. He shared that given the social unrest of the last few months, his daughters are eager to do something to help. What better time than now, he thought, to engage his daughters in their philanthropy, which he had been meaning to do for quite some time. Doing so also meant engaging his parents in the conversation. He feared, though, that his parents, he and his wife, and his children would not see eye to eye on their giving priorities, and he was unsure how to proceed. At the Foundation Center for Design Philanthropy, this is a scenario we hear all the time. It has become even more at the forefront over the last few months as families have come together during the pandemic. Our experienced staff work with these families to bring multiple generations together around shared values and giving. Now, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce an expert in this work, Joline Godfrey, who will be sharing with us many similar stories and scenarios. Joline is a longtime friend and partner of the Foundation. Having spoken many times to our community of donors on topics related to multi-generational philanthropy and raising philanthropic children. Joline is a Senior Vice President and Managing Director of Family Learning and Programming of Hawthorne PNC Family Wealth, a business dedicated to serving the needs of individuals and families with investable assets in excess of $20 million. She is an accomplished author and has built unique developmental approaches to financial education, which she shares through speaking engagements and consulting opportunities around the world. Today, Joline is going to share her expertise with us. Welcome, Joline.
Thank you,
So,
Naomi.
Sure.
It's great to be back with you. It is one of my favorite communities. So thanks for having me back.
It's really always so wonderful to have you. And I would love for you to really begin by sharing with us a little bit about how you got into this work, just an overview of some major trends you've been seeing over the years, main questions and topics families are coming to you with today.
Boy, at this stage of my career, of course, that's a very long journey I've been on. But I think it's fair to say what's relevant now is I started out very long time ago now, really looking at the issue of financial education for children. And we're now talking decades. So back in the day, what I understood was that we just assumed that kids would grow up and they'd either be responsible or they wouldn't. And in part, that's because once upon a time, family finance was much simpler. I mean, many families didn't have credit cards. You couldn't invest on your own. Philanthropy wasn't as complicated as it became over the decades. And so it was perfectly reasonable to think kids would grow up and they would listen to their grandparents and their parents and they would absorb the values of the families, and it would go on in a pretty straightforward way. And then I think the 80s came around and the 90s and the internet, and suddenly it was like, excuse my expression, but all hell broke loose in a very real way. And I began to see families who wanted to raise really mindful kids. They would say, you know, what happened? We were going along fine, and suddenly we have kids who are spending too much or haven't figured out quite how to be part of our family values around money. And so in those early days, I was really focused on basics. How do you as a family communicate the financial values of the family and really teach kids to participate in some meaningful way? That went on for a very long time, getting increasingly complex, of course. And then, of course, in the last couple of years, um, between changes in social expectations and politics and economics, as kids were getting much more tuned in and active, both socially and politically, family life also continued to get more complex. And then came COVID. And now we are at a place where if you were a senior in high school last year and going into your freshman year, or you were a senior in college and assuming you were going out to get a job, whatever we thought our paths were for that next generation, they have been completely disrupted. And that's true across the planet. It's not really as though there's any safe place to go. It is that all families everywhere are really looking at how do we help our children on these paths and how do we prepare them for a future we can't even imagine. So that's where I am today. And I'm spending a lot of time working with families to answer that question. And I know that's what you all are doing at the foundation. That's a lot.
We are, and it's a lot. And just to clarify, before I kind of get into more of the meat of how things have changed now since COVID, what age, when you say children, working with children, what age are you talking about?
Well, this is where people stop breathing because I normally say, well, you know, we really need to start when kids are 5 or 6. And I can't tell you how many people really think, what, 5 or 6? But yes, 5 or 6, because what we discover is that it turns out children are picking up the family's behavior and values as young as 18 months. And so you can imagine by the time they're 4, 5, 6 years old, they've been watching the patterns in their family. They have been understanding that There is a way to behave. Modeling has been going on. So when I talk about those very young children, I'm talking about how we communicate values and language early on. And we do that through stories and games and experiences that are communicating things in a quite a deliberate way. So I think young children, tweens, teens, college students, and young adults. So I think developmentally, when I talk about kids, it's a broad spectrum.
Mhm.
And I think that's what you
Got
do
it.
at the
Got it.
foundation as
And
well.
so yeah,
I think that's what you do at the foundation
we
as
do.
well.
And I
Yeah,
We do. And, typically it's, when the child is 18 or 21, or really as they're entering into young adulthood, when the parents are starting to, come to us and say, how do I engage my child now? And I think it's a different kind of engagement when they're at that much younger age, but there still
yeah,
is a way to do it, which is so interesting.
yeah.
And I wanted,
No, I was just going to say it's very similar to teaching a second language or a third or fourth language to kids.
mm,
The earlier, if you're learning Spanish from, young teachers or nannies, you're going to pick it up pretty quickly. If you're not picking it up until you're in your 30s or 40s, you have to take a pretty strong immersive course. You can still learn it. It's just a different mode of learning. Money is the same way.
right, right.
Oh,
Well, so now, as over the last few months, I speak to donors, I speak to my colleagues, I speak to friends and family, and unprecedented is a word that I hear everywhere I go. These are unprecedented times. And
right,
so I know, anybody who lived through the late 30s or the early 40s in Europe, they would tell you this is not an unprecedented time, that
right.
there have been other times similar to this. So could you talk about what is different in families now that has an impact on leaving a legacy, on their philanthropy, on their family life?
I think there are a couple of things that are different. And, on the one hand, I would agree. I think unprecedented is unprecedented when the world is in crisis or feeling confused. I think there are some things that are universally true, but I think there are a couple of things different now. One is when I talk to young people, both in high school and in college, one of the things I'm struck by is their sense of time is different. Those of us who've lived a little longer, we have this sense that we can just hold on, grit our teeth. We've lived through hard times before, we'll get there. And there's this future orientation that we have. If you have smaller time frames in your life, you don't have the same future orientation. And so I think that ability to be resilient and optimistic is hampered a bit. So that's one of the things that frankly I worry about these days. The other thing that's different, and I think this is both good and bad, is that back around the 1930s, you did not have a way to connect with your social network in the way that we do today. And that is, as we know, a real double-edged sword. On the one hand, you can say, well, kids now have a way to connect in a way that's keeps them from being completely isolated, and that's true. But it also is a way to share their anxiety in a way that is troubling. And I worry about the fact that they ratchet one another's anxiety up as much as they maybe sometimes diffuse it. And so we see a kind of rise in anxiety, a rise in anger, a retreat into relationships with peers sometimes that does put a bit of a rift in the relationships within the family. And so I think the factor of the internet in that way, which is, extraordinary. It's not that I'm here bashing the internet. It is that it has other unintended consequences we just have to be really aware of. So that's different.
It's
Um,
interesting. Do you think that, when particularly a young person, a millennial or a Generation Z, when they're sort of seeing on their social media accounts, this is what my friend's family is doing, this is what, somebody else is doing, mom and dad, I want to do this too. How
yeah,
does that, how does that impact the way young people in particular are really thinking about it?
I think that it's funny. On the one hand, it is a great mobilizer. I remember being on a virtual family meeting a few months ago, and the social justice movement had just popped out. George Floyd has just been murdered, and there was this sense of outrage around the country. And I remember it was right at the start of the family meeting, and I gave people a chance to chat. And one of the young men in the family started to talk about everything the family had been doing in terms of setting up food banks and trying to mobilize to make sure families had what they needed. And then there was this social justice piece that popped out as well. And in front of probably 20 other family members, all he could say was, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? What he was talking about was not feeding the hungry, which he knew how to do. Now he wanted to know, how do we heal our hearts in some way? And I think that that conversation among his cousins was probably one of the most powerful in that family ever, because honestly, I had not prompted this or expected it in any way, but suddenly here we were in cyberspace, tears everywhere, because in fact, he was saying out loud what many had been feeling. What can we do? And he wanted to be
Yeah.
responsive. And I suspect you're seeing some of that as well. So yes, I think on the one hand, just the presence of our virtual platforms mobilizes action. As I said, it also, if you get the wrong crowd, it can feel like we don't know what to do. And so one of the great advantages of the foundation, I think, is this ability to facilitate a conversation so that you can move people along and they don't get stuck in, well, I don't know what
Yeah.
I can do, and that's a very important transitional moment.
Yeah. And, I think especially right now, we're seeing such a heightened sense of activism from young people right now. And
Yeah.
so, how do you suggest, how do we find a balance between passing on what is important to us and important to our parents and our grandparents while supporting our children's interests, especially right now when our children are so geared up and riled up to really engage in social justice? How do we balance that?
One of the things I'm recommending a lot right now is that, particularly for families who've had foundations for a little while, or have done the work and are clear on what their mission is and their strategy and their vision, one of the things I'm recommending is that everybody just pause, take a moment, and review that strategy. Because even the most well thought through strategy may have been exactly right for 2 years ago, but it may not be right this moment. And it's not that I'm suggesting people need to do a knee-jerk reaction to whatever is going on right now, but in order to be inclusive of the rest of the family and the other generations, I think it is a moment to revisit strategy. And that's more than just pulling it out of a hat and saying, we're going to focus on this and that. As you know, there are very interesting, juicy, fun ways to revisit philanthropic strategy in families. And I think those families who will take the time to do that find that they are now embracing and bringing the next generations along, rather than getting immediately stuck in what one generation thinks, this is who we are and this is what we're doing, and the next one says, yeah, but don't you see what's going on? So I always these days say, look, just take a breath, stop for a moment, rethink the strategy, and then I think it's much easier to go forward together.
It's interesting, along those lines, one of the exercises we do sometimes at the Center for Design Philanthropy with families is we have these values cards
Yeah.
where we have each family member sort of choose what are their top 5 values. And what's fascinating is, everybody at the beginning thinks, my values are completely different than what my kids are, what my parents are. We're never going to come to that common ground. And what we find is, while there might be some that are different, there are always some where they can find that common ground, and
Right.
they share, and that's where those families can really focus on the area that is shared.
Yes. It's interesting. I use those cards too. I love them. And 2164 gave us a fine gift in those cards.
Mm.
But one of the things I've been doing lately is mapping with them. So if you create a map, literally, it's all of the values down one axis and all the family names across the top. You do immediately see where the overlap is for who has what values in common. There's something very, I think, comforting about looking at that in black and white. But then you also see the diversity inside the family. Um, I work with some colleagues at the Harvard Business School who wrote the book Collective Genius. And one of the things they talk about is the importance of creative friction. That is, it's not important that you just are in alignment on everything. It's important that there's enough intellectual life in the family that if you have different ideas and can facilitate and manage the friction that comes with different ideas,
Right.
you'll come out with new things. You'll come out with innovation. And I think those cards make it really tangible and clear and concrete as a way for families to embrace those those values. Ellen Perry talks about building a big tent for families so that it's not as though you have different sectors or different segments of the family. You find a way to bring it all in
Yeah.
together, because if you have a family with different ideas, it just means you're an interesting family, not that you're a family with problems. So yes, as you can tell, if you talk about those cards, you trigger all kinds of things that you can do with those
Yeah.
cards. Happy you're
Yeah.
using them.
They're a great resource. They're a great resource. And I want to stick on this topic for just a little bit longer because, I really want to kind of emphasize this point of how do we get families on common ground? So,
Yes,
when you think about boomers, so anybody who now is between the ages of 56 and 74, they were coming of age in the 60s and 70s, trying to break away from the past, whether it's their hair or their music, it caused friction in families. And
yes.
see that happening today with millennials, with Generation Z. And I wonder, have the boomers, have they forgotten how they felt when they were coming of age? How can we bring families together when sometimes their views on the world are really so different?
So different. Well, I have to say personally, I'm really happy that that phrase, okay, boomer, has kind of gone by the wayside, because that was a little alienating, not very helpful, but I think that what has replaced that, which is fascinating because it didn't take very long, is that we came to understand that we've got to really start listening to one another in a whole new way. I'm so struck with the fact, and I'm guilty myself, we believe if I could just explain it to you, you'd understand.
Yeah.
And I think that that impulse to splain, we make fun of mansplaining all the time, and yet we may in fact be splaining ourselves in all kinds of ways. I think this business of taking time, sometimes with a facilitator in a family, to do some powerful listening is a way to open up. And even if I think coming to common ground is great, but I really am more and more looking for third ways. That is not your way or my way, but a new way. How do we take what we each bring to the table and find a new way, a fresh, innovative approach to whatever it is we're trying to do, and let go of having to be right or having to be the winner, and really embrace this sense of we're one family. We have all this sort of juicy difference we can call on. How do we find a third way? And of course, I think that's true for communities and our national issues as well, but we can model it in families.
I think it's a hard thing to do. It's a challenge, but it can
Very
definitely be done.
Well, and I think I will say, you cannot underestimate the power of facilitator. And I do think, for anybody listening, one of the great resources I think the foundation brings to families is this ability to be that party who can help people actively look for that third way, because unless you're being quite deliberate about that, you're going to resort to either or. I mean, we are seem to be binary in our thinking all too often.
Right.
And breaking out of that, I think, is the work we have to do here.
Agreed. So I'm going to shift a little bit, um,
Yep.
and talk about over the course of the last century, the nature of philanthropy has
Mm.
really shifted. So it went from people thinking of it as charity to social service and safety nets. And then we sort of moved toward more strategic philanthropy, social ventures, impact investing. How has this evolution of philanthropy and the way we view philanthropy impacted families? And how can families plan for building legacy in the coming decades, given this continuous shift?
Wow. Two giant questions. I'm going to hold legacy over here for just a moment,
Sure.
because the first one, that shifting idea of, going from charity to philanthropy to social impact has, I mean, it's really happened in our lifetimes, really. And I think one of the outcomes is that it has brought money front and center, into the family conversation. And so suddenly kids are interested in investing when they're 11, 12, and 13, because somehow they have a sense that that's, if they can get their family to invest in this and not that, if they can get their family to divest from this and not that, they can have impact. So it pulls them into needing to understand basic financial ideas much earlier than they might have needed to. When the task was just to give away money to good people,
Right.
that was pretty straightforward. Now, I teach kids about due diligence at the age of 6, 7, 8, and 9, because due diligence in philanthropy, whether it's in social venture or in strategic philanthropy, is as important in this world as it is in making more conventional investments in the rest of the family plans. And so I think of the importance of financial education now as economic self-defense. If you don't understand the basics there, you're not going to be able to translate it over to the work the family is doing in their philanthropic inclinations. Now, I will say that one of the things I'm struck by is how often, I don't know, it can be a 15-year-old, a 25-year-old, or a 55-year-old who will come to me and they'll say, look, we are now having pretty sophisticated financial conversations in our foundation meetings. I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand what the advisors are saying to us. I don't understand what the reports mean. I'm an imposter. And that, whether it's a 12-year-old or 15-year-old or a 55-year-old, it does sort of undermine the confidence and the good feelings people want to have about their philanthropic involvement. And so it used to be people would learn how to do philanthropy and they learn how to do financial education. I really came quite a long time ago to understand these two things have to go together, because what you want are kids at the table who are growing up in a tradition of financial mindfulness so that they will make decisions that are as smart in their philanthropy as it is in their family's business dealings. And I think that then leads us right into that question of legacy you were raising a moment ago, in that legacy isn't just what one generation hopes to leave behind, though it certainly starts there. I think legacy over the last couple of decades has become somewhat more organic, because you are pulling in other generations, you are pulling in other members of the family. And so if it's just your way of the highway, you're going to lose the rest of the family pretty
Yeah.
quickly. And I think figuring out, looking at legacy as a living, breathing, evolving set of ideas and values in the family is how you keep young people engaged. If they think they're just making you happy because they have to do whatever you've told them to do, they're going to go off and do their own things pretty rapidly. But if they feel like they're part of this thinking, breathing organism that's coming up with these things together, they're in.
Yeah.
And again, I mean, I think this is not something that just happens. You get up in the morning and you know how to do it. This is a skill and a talent and, discipline that unfolds over time. I have one young woman that I've been working with lately who, after I'd been with her for just a few weeks, she kept talking about, she tried this for 3 weeks, or and then she tried something else for 3 months, and she was such a failure. She couldn't master anything. And finally, I realized that for reasons I can't understand, more and more people think they're supposed to know things right away. And I sent her out to read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers so that
Mm.
she would understand that becoming part of a family foundation, it starts at 10,000 hours. It's not something you do in an afternoon or a couple of months. It is something that people are practicing and working at for a very long time. And I think those families that are being persistent and purposeful and really stay with this, I think they have a much better shot than families who meet once a year and think kids are going to know what the heck is going on. So
Yeah.
that's how
Yeah.
you get legacy.
It's a process, legacy. Like you said, it's not a one meeting, a
Right,
one time thing, and you get it done. Do you,
right.
I loved your example of a young person who wanted to understand better. Do you have a concrete example of perhaps an older person who has been engaging in this philanthropy in more of a charity kind of way for so many years and was trying to sort of shift their mindset?
Oh my gosh. All my life, I'm going to remember this one extraordinary woman in Northern California who was 65 years old the first time I met her. And she had suddenly, her trust had suddenly opened up to her a little later than it does for a lot of people, I think. But suddenly it was there, and she honestly didn't know where to begin. And I think part of her felt discouraged by the fact that this was a stage in her life when she didn't feel quite as elastic in her learning as she had been decades before. But what was so remarkable about her is that she was hell-bent. She was so intentional and so hungry to do it right. And I think, we were talking before the program started today about the importance of being a learning family. I think it was Eric Hoffer who said, the learners will inherit the future. The learned will be prepared for a world that no longer exists. And I think whether you're 65 or 15, if you are part of a learning family, a family that really is engaged in and kind of eager and excited about just and curious about learning, I think you will raise family members who understand that they're not going to be judged for so much for what they don't know. They're going to be encouraged to learn what they don't know. Um, that's a shift, for many of us who grew up thinking we had to get smart about everything and prove how smart we were. The world is just too complicated. There is too much to know. There is too much to learn. I think learning together, learning in a family culture that encourages this is a much more loving environment, frankly, than feeling that, oh my God, I don't know what's going on here at this meeting. I'm going to just check out and read my iPhone. And, that's pretty discouraging. So, yeah, I think there is. It's funny. I will say, even as we're talking, Naomi, I feel like I get so excited about families because the potential is so extraordinary. There's so much in families that we have not tapped. We've been working at innovation in businesses for decades, forever. I do feel that we're just at the beginning of understanding the capacity and the potential of families to tap and develop their own innovative cultures. And so you can see I tend to get a little carried away
That's
because
great.
I think, this is where change happens.
Yeah.
It is in these small family units, and some of these families, as you know, are not small, they're huge. But it's in our family units that we begin to model change. And if we can do that with enough families, we change communities and we change the world. And So for me, families are, it's just such a great starting point. You can tell I
I
get a little carried away.
And I mean, and I agree with you. And it's, every time I work with a family who, and you watch the evolution and you watch, them coming from the starting
Yeah,
point of what do we do? How do we get started to we are now, feeling really good about the meaningful giving
yeah.
we're doing. And it's an evolution.
Yes.
Do you
You
want
know, I will tell you, I just want to say to that point, this was a couple of years ago. I was at one of the conferences I'm sure we both gone to. And there were four generations of Packard women on that stage.
Mm-hmm.
And it just crackled with electricity because you had the youngest to the oldest, and you could see they were all engaged in the most exciting way together. And so change happens in that family. It's fantastic.
So
Sorry.
Joline, so what happens? What happens when there's a family that some of the members of the family just won't budge? What happens in that case?
You know, that probably is the most important question. I think as a younger person, I would spend a lot of time beating my head against the wall because I am persistent and I believe that we all have the potential for change. I've shifted a bit. And now what I say is if there are people in the family who really are change agents and leaders, they have to worry less about bringing everybody on and do more action. Just
Mm.
start with whatever seeds in a family you can and begin there. It may mean that you're leaving a big chunk of the family behind, but I don't think you can always change people. I don't think you always can bring them along. Now, that doesn't mean I give up quickly or easily. But I think, you're putting your finger on something that so many families deal with. That is, there are obstacles in the family that say, no, we're not going to do that. And rather than give into it, I think you have to find your own way to move forward. And again, I think now we're talking about the power of an outside body to help you innovate around how you do that when it seems that there are no paths forward. So it's not easy, but it's crucial.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's particularly crucial for little kids. And I say that because, again, if you want children to grow up in a creative learning culture, and there are obstacles in the way that make it seem like, no, we're going to just tamp everything down so nothing ever changes. There's got to be some change agent in that family who's letting a little light in somewhere because those kids need that light. However filtered it may be, there's got to be a little light. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it has to happen.
Children often bring light. Young children
Yes,
bring light.
indeed. Indeed.
And one of the things that some of our donors do at the foundation, perhaps there's sort of one area where a family can really get on common ground on, and perhaps there's others that they really can't. And so what we've seen some donors do is open separate donor advised funds for their children or their grandchildren, so that that grandchild, for example, has their own set of funds that they can determine on their own. These are the funds that I really want to do, what feels meaningful to me as an individual. And then we have our family who gives together on other issues. So there are ways to sort of balance so you can really fulfill all of your different passions and
Yes.
meaningful.
And I think you can also take a page from what we've done over there in the business world for a long time. And that is really create what I think of as either a beta or a prototype arm of your foundation work,
Right.
a place to, we talk about seed funding all the time. And if you want to really get active about seed funding in a family foundation, what better place to start than with a 12 or 13-year-old? I mean,
Yeah.
I will tell you one story that I'm sure there are families just kicking themselves. So I think it was 2014 maybe, or 2013. It was one of our camp startup sessions. And we had the chance to go visit the Tesla factory.
Mm.
And we had, the kids all had to sign waivers, and it
Yeah.
was top secret, but they went in. And as you can imagine, many of them went home at the end of the summer and were trying to talk their parents into investing in Tesla. And one family in particular had already made a pretty good sized investment in Fisker, which, we don't even know who Fisker is anymore. And they ignored that 13-year-old kid. And I will tell you that these days, what I say is, look, if you want to know what to invest in, talk to your 13-year-olds. They are out there on the edge. They're
Yeah,
paying attention. Do not ignore that intel that you have sitting in your family.
it's true.
So, so again, we're back to listening deeply. So,
Yeah, yes. So you are known for nurturing financial fluency in families. That is your
I
um,
think,
so what does that mean? And how is it relevant to the lives of our donors at the Jewish Community Foundation?
you know, um, I do think financial fluency, and this is within the context of philanthropy and without, is just that sense of self-confidence that means you can walk into any meeting, and if somebody pulls out a financial report or a balance sheet, you're going to be able to follow it without thinking, oh my God, this is so boring. Or worse, I don't have any idea what's going on here. It's just it's like any culture. If you
Mm.
cannot access the culture because you don't know the language, you miss so many of the cues, you miss the opportunities, you miss the things you could have paid attention to. So my intention has never been to raise little accountants or little tycoons. That's just never been. I'm trained as a social worker, not as a financial advisor. But my intention has always been to make sure people have the tools to be able to make good assessments, to listen properly, to know if they are making good decisions. I mean, it's as simple as a kid who's ready to go off to college and they have no more idea if they should be spending $2,000 a month or $20,000 a month on rent because they have no context for it. My favorite example of that was, some years ago, I remember being in a living room with a family and I asked, there were 4 kids who ranged from, I think, about 8 to 18. And I remember saying to the kids, so what do you think the electricity bill is here in the house? And it was a big, lovely house. But they sat there on the couch and it was like, I don't know, 10,000? 10,000 is a popular number among kids. It's like, that's a good guess. But I remember thinking, had I asked them how much their jeans cost, they would have known in a minute. But this other context of their lives where the stakes are bigger, if nobody takes time or trouble to bring you into the conversation, you don't have any way of knowing. And then when you don't know down the road, you either feel stupid or people start judging you. And my goal has always been to prepare people so that they feel confident and sure of themselves no matter what financial context they're in. And we all get into financial contexts all the time. So that's for me what financial fluency is.
Yeah, yeah. And it's very clear that, I mean, as you said from the beginning, starting that at an early age,
It's
then
just easier.
then they'll know what the electrical bill is. By the time they're adult, they'll have more of that
Yeah.
sense.
Now, I will say there is a 20 something I'm working with now who, her parents didn't start her off. And we're starting off by reading the left, that skinny left-hand column of the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
We start there. And we start there because that's going to give us access both to what's going on in terms of language, what's the vocabulary, what's this about? We do the research, the reading. It's just so much more interesting than going over her budget together. We'll back into that budget. She's going to get there. But she's getting pretty jazzed about reading the Wall Street Journal now. And, that's not sort of the easiest thing to start with.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think there are many creative ways to go about financial fluency.
I'm going to ask you a question from one of our attendees
Okay.
who's asking, how do you connect your kids to their family's legacy? Well, I don't necessarily need them to give what I want to give. I'd like for them to connect to and identify with our family's history of tzedakah across the generations and across many countries.
I don't know if this response is going to be very popular, but I think that we often think of legacy as a static thing, as though it is something that is concrete and we know and we're familiar with, and it's true. I think one of the ways I like to start is by asking kids what they think their legacy is, what they want their legacy to be. Now, first of all, most kids don't really understand in a deep way or even intellectually what legacy is. And so for me, that's a deeply experiential, long-term unfolding, unpacking of legacy. And you know, I think of my own grandparents' legacy. It came to me years and years ago when my grandfather said to me, we owned a, a, a business, and he said to me, Jolene, it's important we take we don't take money out of the community without putting money back in.
Mm.
That was his legacy to me. I think about that every single day. And it was, 40, 45 years ago, that man said that to me. That was his legacy to me. It was a set of values, a way of being in the world. So I think helping kids understand what legacy is, understanding ourselves, what we mean by legacy, so that it has some connection to kids. So it has not something that they have to adopt or embrace because you said so, but it has something that has meaning to them and to us. And I think we're back to, this doesn't happen in an afternoon meeting. This happens in a series of experiences and meetings and time over dinner that gets designed and gets pretty deliberate. It's not an accident. I think it's the juiciest, best part of family, but
Mhm.
it's probably something you have to design rather than something that just happens.
And I know there's a number of Jewish nonprofits and not Jewish nonprofits that we work with, that what they really do is, perhaps they're an arts organization, a theater organization, or perhaps they're a social justice organization, and they're really using sort of modern day themes, whether it's
Right,
homelessness or hunger or
right.
whatever it may be, to really connect young people to themes of the past. And so rather than just, you must learn about what happened this many years ago, this is what's happening today, and it connects really nicely to what happened, you know
You
in,
know, a very extreme version of that, Naomi, because I think that's a great example, is, for families who've been serious um, supporters of major museums, to be able to say to a young person, well, where does graffiti fit into this? That's kind of an extreme notion for some people. And yet, God knows, graffiti has become quite valuable in some
right,
circles.
right.
But it is opening that definition as you're talking to in the family, so that it's not just this, but it's this. And we're back to that big tent now.
Yeah.
Um, I know that sometimes that may feel like we're just letting go of standards. Don't you understand? And yet again, I think quite organically about where families are going and how that moves from one generation to the next.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to get to a couple more of the Q&A from the audience. Share with us some of the big opportunities you see for families in the next decade.
Oh my gosh. I
In,
was
in, in a minute or two.
oh my gosh, I was making notes earlier. There's so many things. I mean, look at the changes that are coming in climate and housing and transportation. I mean, if in good heavens, we have a generation whose children may actually literally go to Mars. That was science fiction for all of my life. And now it is not a completely crazy idea. So I think in some ways, this is the most extraordinary moment. I mean, I know I'm a true Pollyanna, and I do think that the future is bright in spite of how dark it has been of late. But we have such big, big issues to solve here on this planet. And I do think we've got a new generation coming who is mobilizing. They're smart. They understand what the problems are. They're getting started 10 years before I was smart enough to mobilize as a young person. But I do think as a family, if you go back and say, okay, what are we going to do that's going to make a difference 50 years out? That's how you mobilize the next generation. And they have real ideas for this that if you nurture, I mean, heck,
Yeah.
you could be busy for a long time. So that's where I think we're going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Joline, I mean, these themes that you've touched upon over the last 45 minutes, they are so in line with what we're seeing, what we're hearing at the Jewish Community Foundation. And I really want to encourage anybody in our audience who's thinking about engaging their family in philanthropic pursuits, reach out to our staff. We can continue this conversation that Joline is sharing with us today. We have time for a few more questions. If you want to submit a question, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I have one here. If you had not had the money conversation with your kids until later in life, how do you start the conversation when perhaps they've received mixed messages about money over their lifetime?
Boy, that's the moment where you really do need a facilitator and you need a plan, and I think you need to just kind of settle into this is not a conversation, but it is a long series of conversations that may go on for a year or two. These are evolving ideas, and it's not just, there are two things. It's not just a conversation out, it is a dialogue. Years and years ago, I remember doing a talk, and I used to talk about the drip, drip, drip approach to financial education. And at the end of this talk that night, it was the president of the bank who walked up to me and he said, Jolene, I think the problem is I've been doing the water hose approach to financial education. I sit my kids down, I give them the talk, they nod, and then we go away. And 6 months later, I have to do it all over again. He said, maybe it really is that drip, drip, drip. And I will say, I think the design of a drip, drip, drip approach to financial conversations in family can be very gratifying and really life changing inside families.
Yeah, yeah. Could you explain what facilitating a values conversation would look like?
Sure.
And this is from somebody whose children are 26 and 29 years old.
I did that just recently. A few minutes ago, I talked about mapping out all of the values. And, it's one thing to say, choose your top 5 values and let's talk about them. It's another to literally put it up on a spreadsheet, on a board, some whiteboard, and look at it, and then let people analyze. Let them talk about it. But you want a third party or somebody who's not invested in some ways to come in and help people really notice some things that might not be noticed inside the family. I know you have a lot of good facilitators there at the foundation. It's really just bringing a third party to the table who can help bring to the surface issues that, if they're just left on their own, might be forgotten or lost, or worse, could create conflict without anybody there to help intervene in some of those conflicts.
I know we find that when we're facilitating meetings, the family comes in thinking, this is the area where we're having a challenge. This is where we can't come together.
Right.
Through that facilitation process, you find actually it's this other area.
Right.
Let's
Exactly.
let's get on the same ground over here, and that will really help us over here.
Exactly. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I would say to that person with the 20 somethings, what an amazing way to spend time as a family, particularly at this point, not just in their family's life, but in our country's life. It's a killer time to do it.
Yeah. And Jolene, what are some resources, either Jewish or not Jewish, that can be helpful for these conversations?
Oh, golly. Well, there is some, well, the book Sharna just came out with, Impact Generation, I think is a terrific book to
Yeah.
take a look at. I think Ellen Perry's, The Possibilities, no, yeah, The Possibilities of Wealth, I think it's called. It's a little tiny book, one of my faves. Obviously, The Foundation is a huge resource. Um, my book is not bad. It speaks to financial education in a more basic way.
I highly recommend it.
Thank you. It's interesting. 2 decades ago, even a decade ago, we really didn't have much in the way of resources. Now we have consultants and white papers and books and organizations. And so families who say, well, I don't know where to start, just aren't looking hard enough. They're not asking the questions, because I think now there is a wealth of resources out there. And I also think, particularly in Southern California, there's the group over at USC to call on, Jim Ferris's group over there. There is 2164, which you guys work with. Oh my God, you can tell, it goes on. There are wonderful things now.
And what I can do for those of you who are interested is I can send an email with some of those books that Jolene recommended following today's webinar. I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested. I'm going to ask one more question. How do you explain finding organizations to develop a passion for? Sometimes the kids see their family involved in a big way, but they're having a hard time relating to something that's meaningful.
It can't be forced. It is truly something you have to pay attention to. And I think that is an observant practice in so many ways. I will say, I remember years ago, a dad came to me and he said, my kid is not interested in anything, don't know how to build his passion. And he said, the only thing he cares about is comic books. And he was so discouraged. And I said, do you understand the field of comic books and illustration and graphics and what's going on out there? Use whatever that kid is paying attention to. I didn't do my fly fishing story tonight, and we don't have time, or this afternoon, we don't have time for it now, but I can send you a paper on fly fishing that speaks specifically to this question, and you can share it with your listeners if you would like.
I believe I remember that from when you spoke.
Yes, exactly.
Back.
So
I do remember that story. And it's a good one.
A paper now that I did for the Jewish Funders Network in Tel Aviv. So I will get that to you.
Wonderful. Well, Jolene, I really want to take this opportunity to thank you for sharing your wisdom, for sharing practical tools with us. And I also really want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today. We look forward to sharing our 2021 Salon Series topics with you in the new year. In the meantime, wishing all of you and your families a very happy Thanksgiving and continued health and safety. My contact information is on the screen, so please be in touch with me with any questions. Thank you.